Move it from here to here, nothing happens. And then you move it here and everything starts to happen. So they tend to do this when they're flying. You know, because nothing happens in the middle. And they put them in an airplane and something happens through the whole range. Now you put them into the King Air and something happens right now. There is no deadband in the King Air. So they tend to do this the first time. The plane's doing this because they expect it to have very little response close to the center. Now, the only reason to bring that up is our gliders, most of them tend to be fairly tightly put together. Exception would be something like the 233 or the 126, and that's primarily because we have large air leaks through the control surfaces, not because the control surfaces might not be accurate enough. So if we sealed our elevator gap, we'd probably get a lot better response from the elevator on those two aircraft. No, I'm not going to do it. Okay, so flying a straight line. The next biggest challenge for most pilots who are starting to learn to go cross country. Now remember what I said. What determines how fast you go cross country?
How accurately you can thermal.
How well you can thermal. How well you can thermal. The more efficiently you can use that thermal, the less time it takes for you to gain altitude, the less time you're in a thermal, the less time in the thermal, the more time you can fly in a straight line. So we can go, and I don't have a good selection right now, but we can go and pull OLC from people who are flying the same exact course. We can even look for them to be in the same thermal. And we'll see that some of them climb very quickly and some of them climb very poorly. And we can surmise a whole bunch of information by looking at that. I think next week I'll bring my laptop and we'll plug it in and we'll look at a couple of these patterns. But the question is, what determines how well I can use a thermal? The answer is, I have to know where the thermal is. Now what I mean by that is, once I've found some rising air, that's indicative of a thermal. But a thermal is this column, usually a column, that is not necessarily round, and I don't know exactly where it is when I first encounter it, most of the time. Unless I have a cloud right there, and I can clearly see where the most powerful part of this thermal is, which happens sometimes. And usually the best way to know where the best part of the thermal is because someone else was there before you and they're turning. Because then, hopefully, if they're a fairly competent pilot, you can come in tangent to them and climb up right with them. The problem is we have a number of pilots in the club who are not particularly efficient climbers, and then you end up fighting your way around them because thermaling protocol says you do not impede the slowest climber. It is poor protocol to impede the slowest climber. If you can outclimb them, then you probably can maneuver around them and continue to outclimb them. All right, so let's talk about making circles. There are two things that affect the radius of a circle insofar as aviation is concerned. One is the airspeed and one is the bank angle. And we can go online, there's a number of places that you can go to. For a given speed, the steeper the bank, the smaller the circle. For a given bank angle, the slower the speed, the smaller the circle. Now, when we look at some of these plots that we'll look at, we'll see circles that look like this. Okay? Not really very round at all. Okay? What's happening? Well, in these kinds of situations, someone let their airspeed pick up. Then they slowed down and they steepened up the bank and they went really, really tight around like this. And then they got a stall and the nose dropped and they went fast again. Okay? Very common thing. So we end up with these two control inputs that we need to be able to control independently and accurately. The first one, and the one that most people have trouble with first, is speed. Because what happens is, we start to roll, we have a nice speed. Let's suppose we have 45 knots. And we roll in, and as we roll in, the nose will drop. And the first thing that happens is people pull back, and that tightens up the turn, and that kind of excites them. And they tend to roll out a little bit, and they pitch up, and they start slowing down, and so they put the nose over. You see what's happening here? There's this combination that you're doing this. You know, you're banking some of the time. So pick something and try to hold it. This is where you start. Pick a speed, keep the speed. The speed is primarily your attitude on the horizon. If the nose drops down, you're going to pick up speed. One of the things that I use, there's two things actually that I want you to think about when we're controlling speed. The first one is the airspeed indicator lags. I don't care what it's showing right now. If the nose is dropping, it's going to increase in a minute. There's no way for it to do otherwise. Well, there is, but we won't talk about it right now. Okay, so normally speaking, if the nose is starting to drop, the airspeed will begin to increase. You know, when I'm working with my students here, they'll get on a particular course, and they confuse the idea of a course and a heading. A course is a line across the earth, and a heading is where my nose is pointing. And so they'll say to themselves, oh, I'm on course, and I'm pointing the right way, and they'll hold that heading, and they start falling off of course because of the wind. And they go, oh, what's wrong? I'm not on course, but I'm holding my heading. All right? They don't see the trend. Same thing is true when we're making these pitch changes. If we can't determine, if we can't precisely see the change in pitch that's taking place, and we wait until we see it in the airspeed indicator, we're way too late. When I'm talking with pilots and I'm teaching them instrument flying, in an instrument environment, we have one instrument that's called the attitude indicator. And it tells us the pitch angle, and it tells us the bank angle. Now, in a 152 or 172 flying at about 90 knots, if I have a bank angle of 1 or 2 degrees, the heading changes really slowly. But if I have a pitch, if I'm off pitch by 1 or 2 degrees, especially if it's down, I'm going to have an increase in airspeed of about 15 to 20 knots before I even begin to think about it. Okay? So the point is, discriminating 1 degree of bank is not nearly as important as being able to discriminate 1 degree of pitch. And the same thing is true for us. If we want to control speed, we have to be able to accurately discriminate very small pitch changes, especially in the higher performance gliders. The higher the performance of the glider is, the greater the effect of an incredibly small attitude change. So, Diana.
Yeah.
Yeah. When he gets into Diana, if he just thinks, oh, I'm going to put the nose down a little bit, he puts it down to 1 degree, he's going to go 25 knots faster with a 1 degree pitch change in that little airplane, because that's how, it's got a short, small chord, it's got a very small, I'd love to fly your airplane, but it requires a very high degree of pitch precision.
Is this a RC?
No.
No, this is his full-size sailplane that he's very wisely improving his skill set prior to putting his body in it.
I see.
Right? Isn't that right?
How long does it take?
Well, I suppose that's up to you. But the point is that if you're in a 152, if you're in a 126 or in a 233, and you put the nose down 1 or 2 degrees, that thing's got so much drag, nothing much happens. You get into the Atlantic, 1 or 2 degrees picks up, 5 or 6 knots, 8 knots, 10 knots. Get into the Junior, surprisingly, the Junior is a fairly sensitive airplane when it comes to speed. Now, it doesn't speed up as quickly as the LaBelle. Now, the LaBelle, you know, if it's cleanly taped up and everything else, label's pretty good. Now you get into your DG. DG has about the same performance as the label in terms of general L over D, but it's a much cleaner airplane than the label. And it's going to pick up speed more quickly with a small pitch change. So the first thing you need to be able to do is to two things. You need to accurately determine that a pitch change has taken place. One of the biggest challenges to the human visual system is that we actually have very acute vision, but we have very poor visual memory. So if I see the picture out in front of me and I turn my head and I look back again and I say to myself, did it change? Very few people can look away and look back and determine that in fact the picture has not changed. Now, this is those of you who have flown with me, you start to make a turn. What do I tell you? Clear, come back, reestablish your horizon, then roll. But while you're rolling, don't look over here to the right, don't look over to the left, don't look in the direction you're turning. Because until you begin to be able to have a certain level of reset memory, visual memory, when you look away in the direction you're turning, I promise you the nose will go up or down, usually down, and you will pick up speed. And you'll look back and you'll go, why am I going faster? I didn't change anything. Well, yeah, you did. Okay, so at the early level of your training, the first thing to be able to do is to scan left or scan right to do your look. Roll into the turn, look at the horizon, set the horizon, watch if it starts to fall, pull it back a little bit, and just let that horizon slice through the canopy or run through the screws on your instrument or whatever you're doing. But now you can hold it, and I don't care what the bank angle is. Doesn't matter what the bank angle is, just try to keep it relatively the same. It can be 30 degrees, it can be 20 degrees, it can be 45 degrees. I don't care. What I want you to be working on is discriminating the pitch change. Now the pitch change is really obvious at a bank angle of 10 degrees. And it's not too hard at 20 or 30. But once you get to 45, it becomes a little bit of a challenge because instead of being this way, it's this way. You understand what I'm saying? Let me see if I can show it to you here.
It's moving.
Here's my instrument panel, okay? And here's my pitch change like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I turn like this, my elevator does this, but my horizon does this. You see what I'm saying? And that seems to be harder for most people to manage. Okay?
The tendency is to want to use the bank to correct some of the pitch.
Say again, please.
There's a tendency to try and bank to correct for pitch errors,
It's not uncommon to shallow the bank to bring the nose back up, because as we steepen the bank, the nose wants to stop more, it takes more back pressure, and the coordination gets out of whack for most people, okay? So you want to start by making circular, constant speed, shallow banks, and slowly choosing a steeper bank and keeping the airspeed the same. Now, what that says is you're probably not going to be as successful making a 10-degree bank in any thermal that we're likely to have. So that's an exercise that you're willing to give up altitude for.
Is the shallow turns.
Shallow turn's never going to be small enough diameter to take advantage of a thermal. All right? And we're going to learn later that, or as you probably already read in your reading, it's not uncommon to have somewhere between a 40 to 60 degree bank when we're in the middle of a thermal. Now a 60 degree bank is going to be a higher speed, and actually there's a asymptotic kind of thing that you can see.
Get like the tangent.
Yeah, let me show you how it works here. You have this kind of line that's like this, and so this is
Let me go the other way.
well, no, this is the way it's usually drawn. Let me see if I can get all the right stuff in it. This is a
At the top of your
bank angle, and this is or this is diameter,
Yeah.
and then this is angle, right here. And so as we steepen the bank angle, we come here, the sink rate goes up, and the best situation turns out to be right in this area here, which is between about 40 and 60. If I bank it up any steeper, my sink rate goes up, and if I bank it up any shallower, my radius goes out. And I have to work myself in between the two of them. So, we can certainly practice in this area, but we have to learn to effectively work in this area in order to get the most use out of our thermal.
Which is a good thing to do in Condor when it doesn't cost you any.
It's a good thing to do in Condor. Very good thing to do in Condor. Learning to make round circles in Condor is a wonderful thing for two reasons. Number one, you can hit the Q button and give yourself more altitude and circle on down some more. But the other advantage of doing it in Condor is actually find yourself a thermal, turn on the thermal helper, go into that thermal and practice making these circles. So, first thing is pitch control. Sir, yes,
One
sir.
question about that is you probably want to use the highest performance glider that's in the pack, right? To practice maintaining your circles and maintaining your speed. You
I don't know whether the highest performance makes a difference or not in this particular thing. I think the problem with using the highest performance is you may have to actually fly it faster than you would fly
The junior level.
the Gemini or the Lebel, yeah,
All right.
or the Atlantic.
I guess I'd say that just because maybe if it's more sensitive and you have to react to, you have to be more sensitive to its gyrations than when you get in the real thing.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not happening quite as fast, and so you're more finely tuned to.
Yeah, might be a good way to, something to work up to. I don't think it's a good place to start necessarily. Okay, so so the first thing we have to do is control the speed. The next thing we have to do is control the bank. The two of them together, we have to control them so we can make a round circle. Now, you may tell me, well, wait a second, why do I need to make a round circle? Thermals aren't round. Okay, so why do I need to make a round circle?
It's going to be the best strategy for determining the location of the thermal.
It's the best strategy for determining the location of the thermal.
You know the size of the area that you're flying if you're making a round circle.
If you're making a round circle, you come back to the place that you started. If you're making something other than a round circle, egg-shaped or whatever, it makes it difficult to map. I call it mapping the thermal. You can't map something if you don't know where you are relative to where you were. And you can only do that if you can make a round circle. Now, what's interesting to me is I want you to go, if you have CU or you have IGC Replay, which uses Google Earth, either one of those tools, if you go and look at the vast majority of IGC files, you will see that most pilots make round circles. Even when they're in strong competition, strong lift, they're not trying to make these kind of wiggly, constant bank angle changing circles. They're making round circles. Why? They've already mapped the thermal out. They know where the strongest lift is. Why do they continue to make round circles rather than try to maneuver in fine control all the way around? Want to take a couple guesses? Let me draw the picture a little differently here. Here's my thermal, strongest section.
They're already at their maximum bank angle.
So they're doing this. So why aren't they trying to follow this inner edge? Why are they just going in a circle here? Now, I don't think if you were to ask them, you would say, hey, you're not aggressively seeking the maximum line through the thermal.
Try to follow the shape of the thermal, which means slow down fast, and those we have to change the speed, which means it consumes the energy because of acceleration and deceleration.
Okay, so you're saying we're changing speed. I would be saying we're changing bank angle.
Okay.
Okay. Every time we make a control input, what happens?
Drag.
Okay.
Drag. If we aggressively try to map this thermal accurately by bank angle, we're putting in so many control inputs that we're adding drag. And the net consequence is we may actually climb better with a round circle. And while I don't know that anyone that I've ever read about says, oh, well, the reason you want to fly a round circle is so that you don't have to aggressively fight through all the controls, that's one thing. Which is easier? Round circles are easier. And here's one of the things that when we start talking about contests, you go and talk to, you read George Moffat, and his philosophy of competition changed over the course of about 15 years as he became better and better. And at the end, he says one of the most key elements of being successful in competition, and I contend that it's the most key element at finding pleasure and success in soaring, is conserving personal energy.
You mean pilot energy? You mean do not...
What I'm saying is, by conserving personal energy, what I mean is, you have X amount of energy that you have available to use today.
Okay, got it.
All right? And one of the things that Moffat's always talking about, back in the old days when they had a starting gate and they had a lot of gaggles, people would fly around in a gaggle for 2 hours waiting for the optimal time to get out on course. We don't do that anymore. We get everybody up, the gate opens up, everybody heads out on course. We don't get too much of this gamesmanship that's very much inherent in the international competitions. But he said, well, you know, the whole idea of getting off early and sitting there for 2 hours, thermaling for 2 hours, waiting for the optimal time to get on course, is incredibly draining of your personal energy. Okay? So, back to the idea of making round circles. Once you've learned to make round circles, they're pretty easy to make. They give you the ability to map the thermal, they give you the ability to reduce the drag, they give you the ability to actually stay in the same air mass within the vicinity. And that's what happens when you start changing speed or changing bank too much, is you slide out of the air mass. It forces you scallop out. Okay? Let's take a look at, let's see if I can, no, I gotta have to do that next time. I'll bring my laptop, it has CU on it, and we'll plug it in and we'll look at some circles. Yes, sir.
So these round circles, this is after you've determined that you've centered it as good as you're going to center it? I mean, you've done some 270s to figure it out, or is this
Okay,
the first
so
time?
we haven't talked about centering yet.
Okay.
So we come into a thermal, and we have to do something to get into the best available lift. And that's called centering. The best pilots can do it in about 2 turns. The rest of us take a little longer. But we're going to talk about those techniques when we talk about stocking the wild thermals. So we'll probably start talking about that next week. Talk about where they're formed, where to go looking for them, and how to get into them in an optimal sort of way.
But along those lines, as Byron's raising, I found it far easier to maintain a perfect circle if I happen to center the thermal.
This is true, and that's because the forces on the airplane
Forces on the airplane.
are, yeah. And you're going to, so let's talk about force for a second, because that was the one thing I wanted to talk about under airspeed control that I didn't. A couple of things to think about. An airplane that's properly trimmed wants to fly at a particular speed. Most airframes have a certain amount of pressure that you can feel in the controls. So I'm in a bank and I'm holding up the nose, and then the pressure changes. If the pressure changes, what caused the pressure is really immaterial. But if the pressure changes, that means the speed's going to change. If what I feel in the yoke, excuse me, in the stick is going to change, then the speed changes. Okay? And so I try to keep a constant pressure in my control yoke. If I pull harder, what's going to happen? The airplane's probably going to slow down. If I relax the pressure, what's going to happen? Probably going to speed up. Conversely, if I feel the pressure dropping off, probably means that I'm pitching over for some reason. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. So the thing to think about is that, that we're going to get an attitude change and we're going to get a pressure change, and that's going to tell us that the speed is about to change. So we have both of those things going on. Let's talk about an interesting phenomenon that most people overlook. I'm flying along and I have a particular attitude. I'm descending gradually going this direction. And I encounter a thermal. Now what's my speed here?
Constant.
60 knots. Let's just say 60 knots, okay? 60 knots. And I encounter a 5-knot thermal. Okay? Right? The airplane wants to keep the same relative angle of attack. What's happened to my relative wind? Yeah, I now have, rather than the relative wind being this way, when I get into the thermal, the relative wind goes this way. Because I'm getting pushed up, right?
So which means
And what does the airplane want to do naturally?
to nose down.
So to hold the same speed, I actually pitch down when I get into a thermal. If I hold the attitude the same, the angle of attack increases. An increase in angle of attack means
Decrease in airspeed.
a decrease in airspeed. Okay? So people get into a thermal and you'll hear them say, okay, you got to push down a little bit. You've heard me say that, right? You got to push down a little bit. Why do you have to push down a bit? Because while you're holding that same attitude, the relative wind went from here to here. So now we're close to a stall. Okay? And the force on the tail has changed. And to keep the same force, we're going to have to drop the nose into the new relative wind. So I... Hello, sir.
Now, I'm with you. The part I'm hung up on is, as you increase your bank, you also need to increase your airspeed.
You do. So what's interesting is that most people don't understand, and now we come back to the airspeed problem, is that they get this attitude and they say, okay, that's where it was at 60 knots. I get into a thermal and now it's 40 knots. How'd that happen? Well, because the relative angle of attack is increased. So I've got to have to put the nose down relative to the horizon.
The DG max L over D, if that's what you're using, is 42, but at 45 degrees of bank, it's 52.
True, but it makes no difference what we're talking about. We're talking about not so much the speed as we are talking about the change in angle of attack because of the vertical motion.
Okay.
You're descending through rising air, right?
You're descending
Yeah,
from
you're
rising
descending
air.
through rising air. That's right.
But the point is that we think about the relative wind here, but we don't think about the change in relative wind because of the velocity of the thermal that we're in.
Regardless of the bank angle, you're going to have to tip the nose into the relative wind to maintain the same angle of attack as you enter an updraft.
Right. Yeah.
And you really see that with an RC plane, because it jumps up
Yeah.
And then it pitches down.
It pitches down, yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the ones that are the easiest ones to use, the best ones are the ones that give you that kind of an indication, where they raise their tail and they start, because they're set for a much stronger trim speed arrangement than we use in our full-size gliders.
Now,
So
it tend
how
to
do you
be
mean
fairly-
stronger?
Excuse me?
You say stronger trim speed?
Okay, so when we trim an airplane, if we let go of the controls, it should hold a speed. Okay? If a gust comes and pitches it up and it slows down, it's going to want to pitch down on its own. It'll accelerate, and then it'll go through a series of what are called phugoid oscillations. And those phugoid oscillations damp out. This is part of the stability that's built in.
Sure.
If I build in a very strong stability, it wants to hold that speed very aggressively, and it wants to get back to that speed quickly. And our models are like that.
The oscillations are heavily damped
Heavily damped, yes. And
in a
they-
model relative to.
Right, because in a model, I'm looking at it from a quarter of a mile away or greater, and it can get out of control in a hurry if relative to the same level of sensitivity that I might have on a full-size airplane. I don't have instrumentation. I'm relying on just the attitude as I can see the airplane at a distance.
Yeah.
So it's a
It's
really
been tough for me.
Huh?
It's been tough for me to see the attitude changes in the fartway model,
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah.
But now that you mentioned that it's going to nose in,
Yeah.
that's a good thing to know.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, the stronger the trim stability of the airplane, the greater the tendency to want to pitch its nose down like that to hold the trim speed. Now, there are aircraft that have very light stability, where it takes a very small control input to make a very large change, and they don't have a strong trim thing. The glider that I'm rebuilding right now has no trim system. In fact, most of the HPs never had a trim system. And you basically would put them at the attitude and let go, and they would stay the last attitude you gave them, except for gusts. What that means, though, is if you make a mistake, it accelerates real quick. It really wants to take off and go. You just got to be careful, and so you have to be paying a lot more attention. So the less strong trim stability, the greater demand on the pilot to maintain that control. Sir?
Last question about that. And is that also a factor of having a CG that's pretty far aft? Or is it just the rigging?
It's a combination of both of them.
Okay, with that,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the far aft CG is one of the primary elements. The glider that I am rebuilding is called an HP 15 with an HP 18 wing. And a guy took one of those HP 18 wings and put the center of gravity at 43% of the average mean chord. Now, Byron goes, ah!
Yeah.
He goes, oh! 43% is way back. And
Usually the 32 or
Yeah.
something.
yeah, usually it's somewhere between 32 and 37.
Yeah.
So this is way back. But it made the airplane incredibly sensitive. And in this pitch out, it told you were in a thermal real quickly.
It really talks to you.
But you have to be correcting for it a lot. So the workload goes up. So as the trim stability goes up, the workload goes down. As the trim stability goes down, the workload goes up.
There was one of the See How It Flies talks a lot about that. It's a
Mhm.
really good resource as well.
Yeah, and if you guys haven't looked at See How It Flies, I'm glad you are. It's actually one of the most incredible resources that nobody knows about.
Yeah, I could bang on the table like all night about that. It's great.
About what?
About the See How It Flies.
About how good it is?
Yeah, it like totally changed my thinking about
Yeah.
a lot of, not only glider flying, but
Yeah. Now, there's actually two websites that I recommend. See How It Flies is one of them. It is av8n.com/how. And the other one is pilotpsy.com. Now, the first one is a online aerodynamic manual. And when I say it's an aerodynamic manual, it's pretty good. It's not college level text, but it's written by a college professor. And it is the best description of aeronautics and flight maneuver effects of aerodynamics that you're probably ever going to be able to read. Chapter 1 about energy management. One of the things to think about is he's talking about the transference of energy from one type to another. In a power plane, we have chemical energy, kinetic energy, and potential energy. In a fixed power environment, which is what we are, then we have a total energy, which is simply the trading of energy of the potential and the kinetic. And he talks about something called the law of the roller coaster. Wonderful, wonderful understanding that you can go through there. Pilotsci.com. I can't remember the guy's name. This guy is John Denker. I can't remember this guy's name. It's a perhaps fictionalized. I say perhaps fictionalized because he doesn't claim that it's fiction. But perhaps fictionalized story starts off with a flight instructor named Sam. But the end result is the guy that wrote it is a sports psychologist. And he's talking about the application of the techniques of sports psychology to the piloting. So it's a wonderful, wonderful book. There's 12 different readings to go through, plus a couple of little stories. And all along the side are all these little sayings that are just a delight to read. So pilotsci.com, really you do not rush through it. It's going to take you days. Think about it. Really, really a great resource. Okay, I think we're about done with circles to make sure we get time to do these last two things. Any questions about the circles? Okay, speed control, bank control, and being able to keep those steady to go around allows us to map a thermal. It also allows us to reduce the amount of drag, and it allows us to probably take the best advantage. Sir?
So one thing that I noticed last year flying was that like the airplane tended to want to get upset, like, and I'd have to manage it to maintain like the same pitch and bank angle. Like if I just hold the controls, it's going to get upset and off what I want, right? So like I'm kind of constantly managing the controls to some degree, right?
Yeah, you're probably never just leaving it alone.
Right.
Now, some airplanes you can, depends on the airplane. We talked vaguely about stability. There's lateral stability, there's longitudinal stability. The longitudinal stability is the trim speed that we're talking about. The lateral stability is the desire of the airplane to want to stay in level flight, actually. Now, you take something like a 126, nice dihedral, you bank it over about 15 degrees and you let go, and the thing will slide and come back to level. Bank it over about 25 degrees and it'll slide back a little slower. Bank it over about 30 degrees and it'll sit there. Bank it over about 40 degrees and it will tighten up. So every airplane that has has lateral stability has a critical bank angle. Less than will cause it to roll out. More than will cause it to roll in. And so for you, you're going to have the situation where I'm going like this and it's going this direction, and then I go like this and now it's going this direction. And that's, as you become more familiar with a particular airframe, you'll find you won't even probably say, oh, the critical angle is 33 degrees. It doesn't matter. You'll get used to the fact that when you're here, you've got to work this direction, and when you're here, you've got to work this direction.
Right. So, but like in theory, there should be some control pressure for like a given bank angle that if you keep that control pressure, it should just keep the same radius, assuming your airspeed stays constant. But in practice, it seems like turbulence tends to throw you out. Or something.
Well, turbulence can definitely, anything that generates a force is going to push the airplane some direction.
And then, like, that might be minimized if you've like effectively found the center of the thermal, so there's like less shear force between each wing, like causing you to.
Yeah, this is true. And you're sometimes, maybe not at North Plains, but in some places you're going to find thermals that are so violent that you're constantly making an input. Even though we're trying to make a nice round circle, to make that round circle takes work.
Right.
Because we're constantly trying to manage the bank angle and the airspeed while the air is trying to upset us, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not like I've got it right now, I can relax. Never happens.
Okay.
Okay, let's look at our charts. Everyone pull out their charts. One of the things that let's see if I can find this one here. The cross-country handbook has a section on preparing charts. Let me see this. Route planning. All right, where to go? Training exercise.
Section.
No? Yeah, there it is. Map reading and navigation.
That is section.
All right, so that's not what I wanted.
Section 5.
Stand by. Does chapter 5 have the map prep in it?
Yeah.
Map preparation, it's number 3 here. That's the one I want.
Section
Okay.
3.
While navigation, this is the second article. While navigation these days is done almost exclusively by GPS, it's a good idea to have a map available in case it decides to come up short. Unfortunately, sectional charts have been carefully arranged such that most glider ports are located under the border of the charts. Okay, the next step is to draw 5 or 6 concentric circles centered around home base. The purpose of these circles is to enable you to readily estimate your distance from home when you are in the vicinity and the altitude required to get there. So, what I did when I created this is I made this thing with our airport right in the middle. Right in the middle. So it's right in the middle of, let's right side up there. Right in the middle of the chart here. Now let's first of all talk about what we're going to do with this chart. And what I really want you to be thinking about here is not the ability to draw circles, but ability to identify references under the edge of the circle. That make sense? Because we want to be able to say, I am at this point, not I need this much altitude. So we'll get to that in a second. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to make some decisions. Let's first of all decide which airplane we're going to fly.
233 or
126? You want to fly the 126, do you?
I'm raring to fly the 126.
Well, the 126 is a wonderful little bird to fly. By the way, next time you go out, tape it up. Because it was leaking a lot of air and making a lot of
I
noise.
take it, but couldn't find any.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you the captain for that now?
No,
No.
I can't find the captain. I don't know if I mind all that much, but.
Yeah, it's a great little bird. Okay, let's think about some things. The 126 has a glide ratio of about 23 to 1 on a good day, and if the sun is shining and no bugs on the leading edge. And so that's what the book says. 20 to 1 is probably a reasonable expectation, but 20 to 1 may not be something that you really want to do on a regular basis because you're adding to your level of eventuality, as the British would say. Eventuality. There are no emergencies, there's only eventualities. Because if you do it long enough, you will eventually have a land down or something like that. So while the 126 is a wonderful little plane to play with, for the purposes of our exercise, let's choose another one, okay? Because I would like to use as a minimum L over D 25 to 1. Okay? Now, which airplane would we use 25 to 1 on? Well, we could use it very easily on Atlantic. Could we use 30 to 1 on Atlantic? Yeah, probably not. Could we use 30 to 1 on the Junior? Just barely. Could we use 30 to 1 on the LaBelle or the 102? Yes. Could we use it on the 103? Yes. Could we use 35 to 1 with the LaBelle? No. No, because that's within one point.
it's a maximum. It's a maximum. 35 is maximum.
So we never want to plan to get the maximum performance out of our plane, right? Because then we're taking the greatest risk. Does that make sense? So we're going to plan for a 30 to 1 and for a 25 to 1. All right? Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this. I can either say how much altitude do I need for a certain distance, or I can say how much distance do I get from a certain altitude. So we're going to use distance for altitude. So we're going to take and put North Plains in the middle, and we are going to assume that we want to reach North Plains at 1,000 feet. So we're going to have a circle around that point, which is 2,000 feet, and a circle around that, which is going to be 3,000 feet, and a circle around that, which is going to be 4,000 feet. That makes sense? So the center of the circle is 1,000 feet. What is that? That's our safety altitude. That's our traffic pattern altitude. That's our little bit of a buffer against the untoward nature of the world. Now, the question is, at 30 to 1, how far can we travel in 1,000 feet? Well, it's pretty easy. 30,000 feet,
Yeah, 30,000.
right?
5 miles.
5 miles. 5 nautical or statuary?
1,000.
Yeah, nautical, exactly, 5 nautical miles. Now, where, I did not give you a scale. I did not give you a scale, but I gave you a scale. Where is the scale of nautical miles on this chart?
The Class D around Hillsborough.
No. The line of longitude here. The line of longitude has 1 degree marks on it. Each degree is a nautical mile. See each of these little tick marks? So, your assignment is to pick one of these two, maybe both. Get your handy dandy little compass out. I'm sure we all have one somewhere. And using this system, I want you to plot out these distances. So we know, in the case of 30 to 1, 1,000 feet is 5 nautical miles. So from here to here ought to be 5 nautical miles. From here to here ought to be 5 nautical miles. Now what you are going to be utterly surprised at is how far away you can be at 3,000 feet and make it back to the field with a safety buffer.
And anything but a 126.
In anything but a 126. Okay, so what I would suggest you do is you go, there's a couple of ways to go about doing this. One is to go ahead and draw some concentric circles on this document. And that's certainly a reasonable thing to do. And in fact, I have enough spares here, and if you would like to print out additional copies, I have it on a thumb drive, and we can print out as many copies as we want. They cost 57 cents a piece. So do you want 2 of them? You're going to draw 2?
I'll take another.
You'll take another? You want another one, Tom?
No, it's fine. You're going to tell me how
I'll
to
do a
print
25,
these.
sure. A 30 and a 25, right?
Huh?
A 30 and a 25?
Yeah, 30 and a 25.
Yeah, I'll do it.
And you can do a 30 and a 35. Okay? A 30 and a 35. Because I want you to start thinking about your big bird.
Okay, give me another one.
Okay, that leaves one more for you.
There we go.
All right, so try to set up a couple of different ones for the average aircraft that you're going to fly. So you probably want a 30 and a 25.
I've actually got these at home.
Oh, okay.
I might even do a 20.
You might even do a 20. He wants to fly, get a 30. There you go, there's your 126.
All right.
Okay, but you're still going to be surprised. I promise you, you'll be surprised when you look at the edge of that circle and you say 25 to 1 or even 20 to 1 is all, go 18, okay?
Where's the margin here? I mean,
I think 15 is too conservative. I think 18 is reasonable.
Okay.
I was going to say, in your private test, they say 50%, you know.
Yeah.
Okay,
The apron string's half, 50% and 75%.
Yeah.
So,
Of, like,
Yeah, and the thing about using that particular process is that that allows you to be really way off for winds. Now, what happens to the rings as we add winds to it? The wings,
shift.
it shifts, it extends into the wind. So if we had a wind coming from this direction, this side would get smaller, it would elongate into the wind like this. Right? You understand what I'm saying? Because the wind is making me cover ground more here. And here I have to come into a headwind, so I'm using more altitude.
Sure.
So it tilts in the direction the wind is coming from. I mean, this is what we call a cone of operation, right? If we look at this, here's the one, here's the other, and we have this cone of operation above the airport. This is what we're drawing. We're drawing a graphical representation of the cone of operation around the airport for a number of different L over Ds. Just don't mix them up.
And that starts 1,000 feet AGL.
I would recommend that you start at a safety altitude which gives you a reasonable pattern. Yeah, a reasonable pattern is what we're looking at. Now, another technique, which we're not using right here, and I wouldn't use right here, is if I have my own airplane and if I have my own sectional charts, I'll create a transparent overlay. That when I go to a new location, like where? Ephrata, I can drop it over it, put Ephrata in the middle, figure out, draw some lines for some of the approaches that I'm going to be going. I need to be this high, I need to be this high. And as you go to some of these more sophisticated locations, I would increase the number of rings. Well, let's instead of doing just 4,000 feet AGL, let's do 8,000 feet AGL. So we're going to have twice as many rings. Can be a little bit unwieldy, but it's also not a bad thing to do when you have some of these locations like Montague. You flown Montague? You flew with me, right?
Yeah.
And you flown Montague with me, and you haven't flown
Not
Montague
yet.
yet.
No.
Labor Day.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we got through that a little faster than I expected. That's fine. Okay. Time, altitude, and distance. Who was I working with that on it was one of you two that I was working with that on Condor. We were talking, yeah, what we were talking about is we need to make an interchangeable set of, we need to be able to make conversions in our mind fairly quickly because it helps us make reasonable decisions. When I'm talking to my instrument students, I tell them time is converted into heading change and time is converted into distance. We do our instrument